Okay, it's time to introduce our keynote speaker. This morning we are going to find out more about understanding. How can we use what already exists in a person's or a group's context to improve understanding, retention, and in general, of course, learning? So, for example, that I'm from the Netherlands and that my native language is Dutch makes it easier for me to remember and also to pronounce the next keynote speaker's name, Thomas van der Wal. Mr. van der Wal, from the company Design for Context, has been building, designing, and managing social software since 1996. He's committed to developing innovative research to create efficient interactions between people and technology. If you are not already knew him from his work, I'm sure that you will remember him as good as a Dutchman can after his keynote. Please welcome Thomas van der Wal.
Thank you. Good morning, Las Vegas. Oh, let's give it a Las Vegas morning energy. Good morning, Las Vegas. Good morning. Excellent. So today, going to be talking about mapping understanding and being able to bring things from contexts that aren't familiar to us to contexts that are familiar to us. Looking at online services, online annotation, and a digital world that enables this much better than we've been able to do this in the past. So starting off with a little bit about who is Thomas. I wear many different hats. None of them I don't really like any of the labels. I tend to find them constricting. And I tend to ask people how they think of me and why they're talking to me. And what they think I know that is able to, what our interaction is. But tend to work in sort of the knowledge management area, working on systems, work on large social software projects, personal information management services and tools. Have, going back to 1990, been working with tagging systems with Lotus Magellan. My second job out of college, I was tricked into thinking that that was the way that we found things, and managed information was that you tag them with context. And then I got tricked, and that didn't exist any longer once I left that job. And they were in file folders, and you had to remember where the structure was, not the context, to be able to go back and find things that were valuable to you and for your work and for your learning and being able to bring things together. Also have been working with social software platforms since 1996, but tend to work in information systems, interaction design, social interaction design, and helping people understand how to interact with digital information to enrich their lives, help them learn, and to help other people learn and share. And most importantly, to live our life, not necessarily live our life in our work. One of the things I don't usually do is go into a deeper background, but it has somewhat of relevance. I was born in Northern California in the Bay Area and grew up all up and down the West Coast. Most people think that the West Coast has its own way of thinking, its own way of understanding things, and there are micro understandings within that. And those sensitivities of moving between the Bay Area, moving east of the Cascades, moving from Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, Central California, in the Bay Area, those understandings and those shifts, moving from a beach surfer community in Los Angeles to Central California, small agricultural community, was a drastic shift. And so the language, how you interact with others, how you learn things, just how things are done, and how to not make a fool of yourself, particularly when you're a teenager, is one of those things that sort of shapes your understanding and how you see the world. But how I learned, and the learning systems that I shifted through across time, also shaped my understandings. So started off in a kindergarten or a preschool that was run by, it was a Montessori program run by British women in Seattle. And so having this exploring and encouraged to explore, and you're taught as you find things. So you stumble into math and addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, as you just sort of stumble into things as one does as a kid sort of wandering around in open space. Hey, what's this? And just sort of this learning, and it is somewhat competitive. And I didn't realize that until after I was in the work environment after college, and someone who had an undergraduate degree in education, was going back to get her master's, pointed out two of us, they're like, you two are the Montessori kids. And they're just like, you're competitive, you're always tearing things apart to see how it works, to see if you can make it work better, trying to understand the world in different ways. And so went from the Montessori school and then into public school system, which didn't work that way. And I found myself bored most of the time, but tended to do somewhat well. Managed to get through high school, took 2 years of community college that followed that system, but in that I learned I had never learned any study skills because I was asked how are your study habits, and I had no clue what they were talking about. Picked up those and then went to a small liberal arts college, St. Mary's College, which one of the things that it has is a great books program, but it takes the mentality of the old sort of learning that's centuries old of small groups that are led by a professor or led by a teacher, but you're essentially teaching yourselves. You're reading, you're sharing what you've read, how you understand things, mapping that, and the students in the round are doing the teaching to themselves for the most part. And when you drift off course, the teacher usually will bring you back. And so having that as an understanding, and then took my last semester of undergrad in England, in Oxford, at the Center of Medieval and Renaissance Studies, so had a taste of the tutorial system, where it is you one-on-one with a professor once a week, given a question. You have to go teach yourself and write a 6 to 8 page paper and have a couple of those a week, and dealing with 800 to 1,000 pages of things that you could read to give you that understanding for that paper. And just having that understanding and that confidence when you come out of that, of just learning, and then being able to also understand your gaps in your learning, but having that ability to have a question and then say, I know how to find out this answer, either through what other people have done or through experience. And so taking those foundations of understanding and learning, that has shaped how I look at digital systems, how things are put together, how people learn interfaces and software. And one of the things very early on is I had a computer very early on, and I learned really quickly in copy coding my own software in the mid-'80s was if it wasn't usable, it wasn't worth my time doing. Then many years later, I learned, again, from the other side of the equation, if you're buying software and it isn't usable, it isn't worth the money you're paying. And so having this ease of use, having this software be usable, having systems be usable, because they should be there to support our lives, not us supporting their existence. So that was my framework and understanding. In the last few years, worked with Dave Gray to write a book called The Connected Company. It started out with us co-writing it, giving him foundations of social software through my social lenses, and being able to look at new work environments, how the new work environment is changing, shifting, working to be more virtual, bringing small groups together, work together, break apart, reform again. And the company that he was his company was bought by another company. The company that bought him bought the copyright to the book. So we wrote out my intellectual property that was in the book. So rather than being a full co-author, I'm a with, which doesn't exactly have a framing, but I have credit as of being a co-author. But it's an awful lot of the ideas are still there. They're just not called what they are, and they're not specifically called out. But it's something that I point to, and an awful lot of people have been stumbling into this book and finding it really helpful for being able to see people working in new ways rather than just hearing about this future of work. So today's talk, I'm looking at essentially how this sort of future of work, future of digital interacting with information, finding it, holding on to it from a perspective of learning is helpful. So the first place to start is about learning, and learning essentially fills in what you do not know. Very simple concept. What essentially we're doing is mapping what is new to what we know. Going back to Montessori school, I learned multiplication because I had a foundation in addition. I learned division because I had a foundation in subtraction, and once you have one understanding, you're able to map something else to it to be able to get to that next level of abstraction and understanding. And so essentially what we know in life is the foundation for what we are going to know. And the big trick with learning is figuring out what maps to what. And then for ourselves, figuring out across all this learning and across these understandings and cross-understandings of things is how to map what to what and to bring what back into context and relevance. we're continually learning new terms and new models for things around us. This is what education essentially does and learning essentially does, is being able to understand one way of doing things is to give new terms on a model to think about things. And one of the things we need to do is essentially build a personal perspective of mapping what we know to these new models and terms and being able to say, if you're learning a new language, knowing that your own term and saying this is red and this is rojas in Spanish. And it's like, this is the mapping. And I know it in one. If you're looking at computer systems and learning a new computer language, you have the basics of understanding of arrays and filters and sorts and if-thens. Knowing what it is in one language makes it easy to learn a second language, and taking models and concepts and mapping them to something slightly different with slightly different terms. But essentially, that's what we're doing through life with language, with how we work with things, coming up with new innovations. Stephen Berlin Johnson calls it the adjacent possible. Our innovations are not things that are wildly out there. It's just sort of that next step that we sort of bump into and say, hey, this maps to what we currently know now. Let's take this next step. So with this personal perspective, one of the things that we need to be mindful of are the terms and models, being that terms and models change. When we add something new, it shifts, but then sometimes what we already know, those terms and models shift underneath us and around us. And the causes for these changes can be sending people to training. I've worked with organizations where they're just like, yeah, our taxonomy and how our intranet and our internal systems are completely a mess, and start talking to them and like, well, when did this start happening? Oh, we sent large chunks of the organization out for training because we learned to be more efficient, but when they came back and they started using these new models and they were rewarded for using the new models and the new terminology, the new thinking, they couldn't find the old things. It's also mergers and acquisitions. These are great disruptors for change and being able to break how we think things. Watching organizations become somewhat dysfunctional until they sort of weave themselves back together, and have worked with organizations that have been going through this to be able to essentially map what the two organizations know using tagging systems and pointing to things on each other's intranet as they bring them together. And so you're able to see what one organization calls the other organization's objects and their services and things in their repositories, and they're doing the same for yours. And so you're building synonym sets and crosswalks between the two until you can normalize into something that brings them together over time. There's also reorganizations, and reorganizations are another wonderful one. You're doing your work just fine in your division or your group, and all of a sudden you have a new manager, a new VP. Have worked in some organizations that are doing this every 4 months or 6 months. We've got to make the quarter better next quarter, so in this quarter, for 2 quarters down the road, we're going to reorganize. And then you have a new boss who has a new way of doing things. And that changes things. And part of this reorganization is getting new management. And new management's always coming in with new ideas and new ways of doing things, which disrupts things. So it makes things a little bit tougher, but you're having to map what you do know to what you don't know, or what you're expected to know, or what the preferred way of doing things. When I was working in San Francisco, I was working in a division that we had really high revenue per hour worked. Was the highest in the company, and the company decided that the whole organization needed some improvement. And going through, this was the early 90s, going through TQM, the Total Quality Management. And one of the things that Total Quality Management required you to do was to come up with a slogan, and to print your slogan on a big giant banner and put it across the wall. I've tended to work in rebel groups and divisions. This was my first that I'd actually worked in, and they were far more rebellious than I was. And our division came up with a term and a phrase that the company had to acknowledge because of TQM. There is no wrong, but they refused to print it. And the motto was, we don't need an effing slogan to do great work. We were sort of the standouts, and 24 people in an organization of about 3,000, and we did great work. And all this disruption on learning this new way of doing things wasn't helping us do our job any better. And the last one is location. And location, just even a few miles, can make a giant difference. I was working with a group up in the Northeast, headquarters in Boston. Their second largest facility, it's a an organization that's all across the Americas. Their second largest facility is 40 miles away. And they can hot desk. And so there's people that live in between, and they'll take a week or two and shift between. And so the people that are in the suburban campus will come into downtown Boston and work, and they're completely confused by the terminology in the same company, the same models, but the terminology, they don't know how to ask for things. They don't know, they're like, hey, how do I find, and nobody knows what they're talking about. And it's only 40 miles different. How work informally gets done is drastically different in those 40 miles in the same group, in the same partnered group that are working virtually in a common system online. In real life and in FaceTime, it works drastically differently. And then by the time they go back to their office, if they stick a few weeks and adapt to the new terms, they're confused when they go back to their regular place of work and are sitting in their, with their usual team. And they're just like, how do I get to the, crud, what do I call it? And the management sort of knows about this. And they're trying to have one language, one model for thinking, doing things across not only all of their own corporately owned facilities, but their subsidiaries as well. And just that is just, for them was mind-blowing, but it's also sort of representative of how humans were really fuzzy with things. And the last one, just watching how things change over time. Time tends to change an awful lot of things, while others, it doesn't really change an awful lot. So being able to watch organizations, that same organization spent 2 years collecting all of their marketing terms from all the marketing campaigns they'd done through time and annotating them on a wiki. Lessons learned, how they went about it, the vendors that they used, all the thinking that went into it. Within 3 years, that repository of 16,000 wiki pages was completely unusable because the terms that they wrote and collected all of these things in had changed. They couldn't search and find anything within that system. They hadn't kept up with the new vocabulary, the new jargon, to be able to say, yeah, we need to take this, this online program for reaching out and enablement, and they're now calling it engagement. And so the enablement programs, they couldn't search when they're thinking in today's terms of engagement. In just 3 short years, had completely made 16,000 pages, and all this work somewhat unusable because they hadn't kept up to the fast shift, particularly in marketing, that the terms have. One of the other things we also have to be cognizant of is that facts change. And facts changing catches an awful lot of us off guard. One of my favorite television programs is QI, which is quite interesting. And it's a British TV show. It's a quiz panel with celebrities that are on the panel. And it's a different kind of game show because the game show is essentially asking common and sometimes arcane questions, but the common answer is wrong. And so you will lose points by giving the common answer, and it also sets off sirens and flashing lights. And so when you ask, how many legs does a centipede have? People will say 100. Centipedes rarely have 100 legs. They most often have 102 or 98, and then 104 and 96, and it goes out, and it isn't until you get down to about the 80s and about 10 out that 100 becomes sort of that next norm. And it's one of the things that we just sort of have taken for granted. QI, one of the famous pieces from their first season in 2003 was, how many moons does the Earth have? Anyone want to guess? So most people would say 1. Sets off the sirens, sets off the flashing lights. 1 is wrong, that person just lost 10 points. Turns out, 10 years ago, it had been shown that there were 2 moons. There was one mini moon that had the same properties of a moon, fit the scientific description of a moon, has a Welsh name that I can't pronounce, or I can't pronounce correctly. I can pronounce it, I can say whatever I want, but it's not, no one will recognize it. But there were 2 moons. And so this is repeated over time, this one episode, and it gets a ton of hits on YouTube of how many moons does the Earth have. This last week, QI asked the question, how many moons does the Earth have? And there was one panelist who was always on the show. And somebody else was also on that show that was on this week's show, and they're like, this question again? We know that we got it wrong the first time. And they're like, and over the 11 seasons, they're now up to the letter K because they're walking through the alphabet on the knowledge of what we don't know. or what we think we know, there's now 18,000 moons. Because there are these mini-moons that within the last few years they've been able to discover with scientific advances and looking at sort of these mini-moons, these semi-satellites. So it's somewhere between a satellite and a full moon, and all of these chunks of rock that are out there and space stuff that's not man-made that follow the orbits just like a moon does, sometimes over thousands of years. And so one of the things that they started pointing out was essentially the half-life of fact. And talking about this half-life of fact, and Stephen Fry, who's the host of the show, was saying that all of the facts from one season, by the next season, 7% of them are no longer correct. So being able to understand how many moons the Earth has, how many legs does a centipede have, these things that are considered fact that we commonly get wrong, and that there are correct answers and scientifically correct answers, those scientifically correct answers and true answers are not true over time. So they went back and did a calculation of all the facts that they have given on QI, going back to 2003, and 60% of them are now wrong. So there is a great half-life drift of these facts, these things that are truth. And so it was really interesting just watching this. And so one of the panelists, they're like, we owe some people an awful lot of points. So Alan Davies, who is the one regular panelist who's there through all 11 years, he got 700 some points back. And on the show, quite often, the winner is in the single digits. With somewhat regular occurrence, the winner will be in negative numbers with what they have. But the goal is to get to the real, true answer and to give an explanation that will give you more positive points. But this last week, and just showing just sort of this half-life of fact, this half-life of information, and understanding what drifts over time, and they pointed out in medical school, most med students are taught in their first year of med school that half of what you're taught is going to be wrong in 10 to 20 years. The problem is we don't know what half. Going back to about 2004, I stumbled into, through reading Wired magazine, a piece on Gordon Rugg and his Verifier Method. And so he's recently written a book, but the Verifier Method, which is used on something called the Voynich manuscript, and proving what it was. It's a centuries-old document with cryptography given to a king, supposedly to talk about a civilization and their buried treasure or something. Nobody knows what it was talking about because they haven't been able to break the cryptography. And so there is a giant prize if you can break this. And he used this method of understanding that he created, the Verifier Method, which is to go out and figure out what people knew at what time and what locations to be able to say, what was viable. And we know that the king was given it in, I think, 1600s. So what prior to the 1600s, as far as cryptography, was available? And so they've done carbon dating of the paper. They've done all sorts of other things. But he used this Verifier Method to say, we knew what was viable. So he ruled out everything up to a certain point of time and had about 7 different options and walked through those. But essentially what he's trying to do is figure out what we know, what's the corpus of knowledge around fact and our understanding, going back through time and then figuring out what we know is based on things that are not correct today. And he's taking the Verifier Method and applying it to Alzheimer's and other medical conditions to be able to say, in science, are we on the right track today? Are we basing our knowledge and trying to move things forward based on things that are still correct? Or are there things that are not quite right or based on a misunderstanding? And going back to one of my early misfacts that I learned in high school in biology class, biology teacher said how many, was talking about the regions of the tongue and taste. And, Americans have been taught that we have, sweetness is in one spot, sour in another spot, the different tastes in different parts. Americans have that understanding because we misinterpreted a German paper on an old wives' tale about the different spots of the tongue having different taste, and they missed the term not. So Americans sort of stand out in this misunderstanding of how our tongue works. But essentially taking that, and it was taught in science, in the sciences for years as the taste in all these different areas, and as proven fact, so they thought. But being able to understand these shifts in understanding this half-life of knowledge, it becomes becomes important to come back to what we're talking about. Holding on to personal perspective, because if you can hold on to your personal perspective, over time you're able to see your own knowledge drift, your own truth drift, your own fact drift, and being able to say, oh, here's what I'm working on today, and I need to go back and be able to find. I know I saw something about 3 to 4 years ago. I don't necessarily know what the term was, what it was called, but there's something relevant in my collection and being able to get there. So getting back to being able to add personal perspective, being able to essentially look back at ourselves and being able to annotate and give understanding. Within the last few years, there's been an awful lot of research on sort of this Web 2.0, this new digital, this new collaboration and collective and crowdsourcing, and people collaborating and working together. And being able to see if there's any value. An awful lot of us have been seeing value in this. From a personal knowledge management standpoint, and being able to go back to, I have a collection on my hard drive in software called Dev on Think, where I have about 30,000 objects, takes up about 12 gigs, and anything that I have found over time and that I run across, which is somewhat regularly, I just drop it into Dev on Think, and it has really good search. Not only good regular search, but then good AI to find other related things that may not have the same terms. But being able to say, I know, I'll be sitting and having a meeting with somebody and saying, this sounds familiar, and I'll just drop in a term or a phrase, and it pops up sometimes their paper, things that they've worked on, or one of their colleagues. And I'm like, this is why this sounds familiar. And so just being able to have that personal annotation, that personal information management, and just being able to have that over, started in 2005, so 8 years, just having this corpus of things that my brain has roughly forgotten, and it's very fuzzy. It knows that there's something there, but I don't know exactly what. And the digital process makes it a little bit tight, a little bit more refined. So one of the research papers from this last year talked about learning for language, and the learner-generated annotation group performed much better than the instructor-provided group, no matter which cognitive learning style they were using. And so essentially the students who were gathered together, and quite often they'll group together because they have something in common and there's common context, they're able to look at language and say, this is like this, and being able to take from their own understandings and map it. Sometimes the instructor may not have the understanding of personal groups and individuals, which allows that information to anchor and tie in much better and more tightly. And so it wasn't necessarily surprising that this was found, but it's really good to have research to be able to say, aha, we're not on the wrong path. There is something to this. One of the pieces that is quite valuable in all of this is personal tagging. So in about 2003, there was a social bookmarking tool that started out called Delicious, which allowed anybody on the internet to go out and tag and build their own collection of bookmarks. So you'd find something of interest, add it to Delicious, add some tags so you could come back and find it. And they were using tags rather than folder structure, but you could add as many tags as you wished. And it also held on to who you were, and it was openly shared by default. Joshua Schachter, who had started Delicious, convinced Stuart Butterfield, who had created Flickr, or one of the creators of Flickr, a social photo sharing service, to add tagging to it, to be able to find relevance in it. And so they added tagging, and it started bubbling up, and I was in an information architecture listserv, and people were talking about what all of this stuff is. And they're just like, this tagging is very different from the just object and tag. It works very differently because it has an individual, and you can say, this person tagged this. I use that term differently, or I use that same term. What other terms does this person use around this object? And begin to get another understanding. Sometimes they're tagging across different domains of expertise and understanding. So we could have an information architecture and a knowledge management and a pure information sciences set of terms all around the same thing, and be able to say, what does this term mean? I don't understand it. This leads to this. And one of the things that the Flickr team did was taking different colors, different tags, and working them across languages, and being able to say, if you take this term and you put it in, so people will tag things in multiple languages, like the color red or lantern, and being able to say, if I put in this term, what shows up in this other language? And they're like, this means lantern, or this means red, and having a synonym and a cross-language dictionary that they're just able to use, and they were using essentially image recognition to be able to identify potential matches. But one of the things that popped up around personal tagging in this information architecture forum, I threw out there the term folksonomy, which stuck. And I was just trying to get the conversation moving forward. And so folksonomy is essentially a bottom-up and individual-focused tagging. Its definition is the result of, folksonomy is the result of personal free tagging of pages and objects for one's own retrieval. So the free tagging is incredibly important. The free tagging is essentially, you're not working from a taxonomy, a controlled list. You're working from what's in your own vocabulary, how you think of things. And for your own retrieval is incredibly valuable because you're not tagging for others, you're tagging so that you can refine whatever this is. And people will name things and call things for their own retrieval far differently than they are for others. Quite often for others, we're guessing. The next is tagging is usually done in a social environment and shared and open to others. And so this is really important so that others can see what we're tagging. And having an object in common, you're able to see the, how many people have tagged something with red, how many people have tagged the same object with lantern, how many people have tagged it with other things. Also, the act of tagging is done by the person consuming the information, not by the person publishing, not by the person who's editing, not by the person who's putting a collection together, but it's by the people who are actually consuming the information. Sometimes they're reading in things and inferring things into an article, into a piece of work. And so having that added to it is incredible value. And when we're finding information and we're like, I know there was an article about this, but our fuzzy minds are thinking that, this article that was written about the Middle East and a conflict between Lebanon and Israel, the article was about a music festival, but what you're thinking about is open conflict and coming together and peace. And it's not, none of those terms are mentioned in the article, so doing regular search, you would not find it. But being able to have that as an example and point to it, if you've tagged it with those terms of your inference, you're able to find it, but other people looking for similar things are able to find it as well. So running quickly through the folksonomy triad, you essentially have the object, you have the metadata, which is the tags, which we traditionally had with original tagging systems, the two-dimensional tagging. What stands folksonomy out is the identity. You're able to say that I have tagged something or somebody else has tagged it. And our understanding of the terms, our backgrounds, our own context are shading the terminology and why we're applying the tag. So what we have with the object and identity is interest. And identity in this case is an account in the system that points back to an individual, may have a profile, but you're able to hold different individuals and who has added the annotations. So essentially people don't tag things they don't have interest in. It's a practice that is somewhat the norm, somewhat by default. Nobody has said don't tag things you don't have interest in. People just don't collect things they don't have interest in. Identity and metadata is an expression of a person's own vocabulary. And what we get between the metadata and the object, or the tag and the object, is a definition by use. But if we're looking for others and trying to figure out how this works in a more broad sense, since it's an open system, you're getting many people annotating, you're essentially finding community using that same inflection point of the object and the metadata, the definition by use. And you're able to say who else has given on this object the same tags. So maybe you're trying to find other people to interact with, maybe you're trying to find other terms that they're using, but there's many different reasons for it. But what we start getting is a shift. The vocabulary becomes terminology. It becomes a little bit more formed. It becomes a little bit more part of the community. One person's edge case term, vocabulary, that becomes a wrong term in the terminology. But you're able to see where there's cohesion and understanding and people coming together within the terminology around the objects and the tags. What we get between, with interest is it becomes culture and the object and between the object and the community. And so what we get if you're looking for, if you have an interest in Audi cars and you've been tagging Audi cars, photos, articles about them, when you start putting Audi in with a community, you get a much broader, fuzzier picture of things because you'll get pen sets, Audi design white papers, Audi production manuals, looking at Audi factories and their change over time. There's all these different things. So you need other pieces of metadata, other tags, in co-occurrence to be able to say, give me Audi pen sets, give me Audi cars, give me Audi design, to be able to filter things down to find things a little bit more clearly, to take some of that fuzziness and ambiguity out of it. One of the things that we run into quite often with these personal tagging systems, because they're now in an awful lot of things. It's in SharePoint as an option. It's in an awful lot of open platform services, a lot of web-based services, is the ability to add personal tags. And quite often, people are looking for the right term. The managers aren't familiar with the value of the personal tagging, so they're like, this term is wrong. We want the right term, so only pick things out of our taxonomy and our known terms. And quite often, people can't find things that they have interest in because it's not the terms as they think in their own vocabulary. So this right term understanding is not necessarily correct. Although if you're trying to find the authoritative term, let's say in learning, and you're in a classroom and the professor has, if you want to get an A in the class and an A on the module, being able to map your understanding to the professor's terms and to the authoritative term, you need to know what the authoritative terms are, the authoritative models, and being able to take your own understanding, map it to something that's new to be able to do well as far as a grade and the reward system we've set up. So having the authoritative terms stand out is incredibly helpful. And I'll show an example of this toward the end. We also have sort of the preferred terms and being able to bubble up what the preferred terms are. So it might be an organization where it's like, this is what as an organization we'd like to have you think of things. We've done a reorganization and these are the new models and our new frameworks for thinking about our work because it's going to make us more efficient. And so here are the preferred terms. So if they're able to add the new taxonomy, the new vocabulary and terminology for it, so people are able to match their own personal terms back to these preferred terms, it helps everybody out. The thing not to do is to remove people's personal terms, because that's their essential hook back to something they want to refine. It's their way to pull something back to themselves from their own mental model, their own vocabulary. So to paraphrase Monty Python, every tag is sacred. You don't want to be throwing the tags out. Every tag has value. You may not want to display them all, but you don't want to be breaking other people's mental models and knowledge systems for themselves. Looking at one of the digital platforms and moving on from sort of the tagging perspective, but sort of the annotation perspective and looking at Kindle, what Kindle's been doing. So within Kindle, we've been able to highlight for quite a while and being able to build our own collection of things and books that we like, or things that we're having to read and being able to say, here are the things that stand out to me. Over time, they've been able to turn on the capability to share these so other people can see them if you wish. But they've taken this sharing with others and added into it also their formal analytics and their formal understanding and understanding of what's in the book that they've algorithmically shaped. And so if you look into it, you're able to I've turned on the show spoilers for a book called City by City. It's a fiction detective story that's set in a sort of science fiction space, essentially something like East and West Berlin, except they overlap each other. So you have one street and one building in the middle of a street that's East Berlin, in the middle of a block that's West Berlin. So in order to be able to see the East Berlin house, because you've been taught and you've been enculturated to not see things that are not part of your space, you go through customs in the center of town, or the dividing space, and then you're allowed to see. But when you're looking at the East Berlin building in the middle of the block of West Berlin, you're not allowed to see West Berlin buildings around you or the people that are not of that domain. And so it's a really wild trek through understanding in the same physical space and two physical spaces that don't acknowledge each other and are systematically and culturally not allowed to acknowledge each other. And then trying to do detective work on both sides of that while keeping within the laws of this overlapped, what they call cross-hatched reality. But being able to have a showing of all the characters, all the terms that are in the book, and then being able to map them and show occurrence. So Basel is one of the cities in the book and all the pages that it occurs on. And it's like, where did I see this? If I want to look at Coppola Hall, which is the center hall that you need to go through to go from one of the cities into the other city, so you can see what page it occurs on. So if you're talking with one of your friends and they've only read about the first 30 pages, you don't want to give away that Coppola Hall is there, because then that starts giving a spoiler away for the rest of it. So you have these things that Amazon has done algorithmically with books. But they've also paired it back with, oh, come on, click, a regular page for city by city. And I've turned on show me other people's highlights. So it's essentially like buying a used book that has been annotated and highlighted, which sometimes can be valuable, save you times. Other times it can be counterproductive, because the person who's had it or the people who have had it are highlighting things that are not relevant to what you're trying to accomplish. And so this phrase up at the top has a small dashed underline that shows me what somebody else has highlighted. And I can consider whether that's valuable to me or not and highlight it myself and add it to my own collection, or just know that this is what other people have interest in. But then I can go and look at popular highlights from everybody else and see what's popular. And so within this one section, there are 14 people that highlighted a certain passage. This first, hey, it works on the wall but not on the screen. Quite helpful. So that first passage has 14 people who had found it helpful. And so it gives you an understanding of potentially who a subsection of the people who are reading the book, they have PhDs or in academia, and finding a little piece of humor in there funny. But then I can also go and look at my own notebook and my own highlighting to be able to bring back things of interest for myself. And I've openly shared these back out. But if I'm working on writing a paper and it's like, oh, I remember something by city, I'm pretty sure I highlighted it. Having a digital version of it makes it much easier to go back and search. For a short time, there was a service that would go and scrape all of my highlights from the Kindle site on Amazon and give me an RSS feed and bring them back in so I would drop them into Devon Think. Another service that's out there, an open platform, is Readmill. A similar book reading service allows you to highlight and share things out. One of my friends in the Netherlands, Kars Alfrink, had highlighted We Are All Designers Now from John Thakara's The Bubble, Designing in a Complex World. And it's one of the most quoted and highlighted phrases in that book. We know that because blogs were telling us that before we had digital books and allowing it to surface. But one of the things I did was I had liked this and put my like on it. But the other thing I did was the social bookmarking tool that I use now is Pinboard. So I use Pinboard to Readmill to Pinboard. So I pulled that into my own collection. And so I have a bookmark for the link, which then links back to John Thakara's book. I've added the tag John Thakara, design, and designer. So if I'm looking for quotes around designer, this will surface. And so within my own collection, Vander collection, I can search for designer and find other things, and the Thakara piece will be there. And so if I'm looking for a quote, or if I'm trying to go back and find a paper to refer somebody else to, I can just drop in designer and be able to find this, and to be able to find a quote in a book through another service. And it sort of ties things together in a very clunky way. One of the things in taking this sort of annotation and bookmarking, I got a call from a symphony that's in the southeast US, the most southeast and eastest US. And it's a symphony that is relatively new, and they have a lot of new technology. And so they are capturing everything that they do, and being a symphony, and I learned the definition of a symphony meant that it had an academic arm and not just an orchestra, which doesn't have an academic arm. So the orchestra is what plays, the symphony is the whole organization with its learning and all of its outreach programs. So the symphony records everything that they do, their performances, their practices, all of their academic master classes, their panels for their students, all in high definition. And so you can go back and watch anything and everything. And it's not only for their own students, and they're hooked onto internet too, and connected to academic institutions all across the Americas. And they're sharing out these videos through not only North America, Central America, and South America, and making it easy to have like the world's best cellist, the best trumpeter, being able to share their understanding of craft. One of the things that was difficult was search, and being able to drop into a 90-minute segment and say, oh, this trumpeter was talking about this embouchure technique to do a certain sort of sound for this certain classical period, that's different. And if you want to do it correctly, here's how to set your embouchure and to give that sound. And so they wanted to be able to drop into that, and it's about 47 minutes into a 90-minute video. And so they reached out and they're like, can your tagging stuff that you're talking about, how does that work with video? And so this was about 2008, or between 2007 and 2009. And late 2008 had stumbled into a service called Video Juicer, an open source platform. Had helped them look at a bunch of different platforms. None of them really did the tagging well because it didn't hold on to the individual who was tagging. It just thought every person on the face of the planet, we all have the same language, the same understanding of the world. And we've learned over time that that doesn't necessarily work well. So found Video Juicer out of Brighton and started looking at that, and it was allowing us to do what we wanted. So had worked through mock-ups and being able to hold on to the authoritative. So classical music and music in general, there are things that are truths around them and known fact, and being able to say, over on the right-hand side, you're capturing the event type, the instrument, artist, the composer, where the piece, the location, and all of these are structured in a way so that they're interchangeable and findable. But within the video itself, a student who's watching the video is able to click on the video when they've hit something, back it up to a spot, click on it, and add tags, and then being able to say, for a minute and a half, and they'll add an end time as well, and be able to say, in this case, this is a cellist, it's cello, it's aggressive technique. So being able to have a loud sound that projects through the concert hall. And one of the things when they were showing the technique was it sounds horrible to the cellist, absolutely horrific. But once you get 15 feet away, it doesn't sound horrible. It sounds like a very loud cello. And so a lot of the students that were in there, when you listen to the discussions afterward, they're just like, this doesn't sound right. And he was walking the students through how to play this very aggressive cello playing. And just being able to drop into this allowed the students to annotate and search what was unsearchable before, being able to drop into specific moments and share them, not only with your colleagues in the classroom and refine them yourself, but to any other musician who understood English that had access to these. And so if you were in Latin America, in Caracas, Venezuela, and being able to say, I want to learn the master cello techniques, if you understand enough English, or you had a pointer from another system to this that had aggressive in Spanish, and being able to say aggressive cello, you'd be able to find this snippet. So essentially annotating the annotations to bring it into your own context to make it easy to find. And so just being able to drop in, and so the red marks on the timeline are the person's own annotations, the black are other people's. If you clicked on somebody else's, you'd be able to see who annotated those. And then right above the tags below, you are able to add a text, sort of a free text, so you're explaining what it is that you're looking at. But one of the things as we were working through this, the students that were doing this and sharing it out with others, they found that it was insanely helpful. In the middle of the project, there was a new product head that was brought in, or the lead, and they were wanting to take out the who had annotated things, and the students were like, no, we need to leave this in because I want to find my own things. And when I refer Susan to this, I want her to be able to find my tags on cello because I know that I have tagged this and it's something in my collection. And what we found from this was that the personal shared video annotations made videos searchable, but also brought up relevant moments and made them identifiable, and broke all of this into smaller chunks. And the smaller chunks we've been seeing in the last few years in things like the Khan Academy, these small modules of learning that make sense and can be reassembled, and seeing in the early 2000s when I was managing technology teams and having to go through learning sessions that were an hour long, and 55 minutes of it was completely irrelevant to any work that we did in the technology we had because it was out of date. But there was 5 minutes that was helpful. It was broken into these small addressable chunks. This one valuable piece that was in there, we could point to it and use it. And what I ended up doing was writing an exception for all of my teams to not have to go through the formal learning process, and I just mentored all of them and brought in other people who had expertise. And that's not something that most can do. And so we were trying to figure out how we could build our own sort of learning system to teach on modern current methods for web development, interactive development, and learning systems and sharing. So what we essentially get with these small chunks, and the small chunks become very relevant. So we see that in Kindle with highlights. We see that with the annotations on video. We see that with bookmarking, is being able to go back and remix and essentially build our own syllabus out of many different things, being able to take small pieces loosely joined and bring them back together into one cohesive piece for learning other things you don't know. So it was a nice system. And so essentially in this same remixable model, if there's modules that you know, you can skip them. And you can, a 9-minute video is easy to skip through to see if there's something that's knowable and new to you, and then being able to move on, but also being able to remix not only Khan Academy, but maybe there's videos from other services that are small modules that fill in, and then being able to post papers, articles that are on the web that show and can demonstrate this, and being able to have a nice little class and a course that you're able to hand off. And I've been watching an awful lot of people doing this ad hoc. One of the things with education, my upbringing, and then talking with an awful lot of professors over time, is I have an incredible fascination with syllabi. I'm always looking for what I don't know, which could be Montessori school, could be the Oxbridge, trying to figure out what those gaps are. And it's like, what's new out there? What don't I know? How can I find more? And so what people have been doing is essentially sharing out they'll have a blog post, and I'm like, oh, go watch these videos if you're trying to do this. Here's how to learn it. Here's how to get the basics. Here's how to get yourself to the next level. And so what we end up with is, from the annotations and tagging, it brings things not only into a personal perspective, but it also connects the new understanding to one that exists that we already know, and therefore it makes learning far more cohesive, and it works far much better. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Maybe we can do that.
Sure.
But don't forget, we also have the keynote conversation at 10 o'clock. Then we have plenty of time. You have an hour. But maybe if there's really an urgent question, you can do that.
Sure. Anyone? Yes. Yes. So the question was, if we're doing all of this tagging and doing all of this sharing, who does it belong to? And from the understanding of property rights. With my experience in working on the Connected Company book, prior to that, born in the 60s, growing up through early 70s, I have a very different understanding. Sort of that times, everything just openly shareable, everybody should know everything. The Connected Company brought that understanding, and I've been blogging since 2000, and essentially sharing things as I discover them out, more somewhat to share what I find, but then also to connect with others who have similar interests, to have conversations, to find out more, and to harden what I know or to tear it apart and realize that I'm completely on the wrong path. But the Connected Company book brought that back into understanding with putting things into a book that had a copyright owned by somebody else where I didn't have ownership of it. And so I was putting something out there that I couldn't go back and reuse. And so the ownership issue comes into play an awful lot. And for the last, prior to a year ago, for 7 to 8 years, I had my own company, and it was essentially myself. And there were some ideas I didn't share because I knew the value of them. And which also went counter to this sort of open sharing understanding. And now that I'm in a company somewhere else, there's more things that I can share because then that will bring in work. and it's things that aren't widely known. And when I share them with people, they're like, wow, that's a really golden nugget. We've been stuck with a problem for 3 or 4 years, and this identifies what the problem is. We knew we had a problem, we couldn't structure it. So I'm able to share those back out because I'm not worried so much about the money tied to it, because I now have a regular paycheck and not having to essentially own my work. And so there's this, within sort of this Web 2.0, this open sharing, this openly bloggable environment and understanding of the world that came up in sort of the mid-2000s and became, in edge cases, very popular, which was extrapolated sometimes incorrectly to everybody thinks this way. What do we do with this knowledge? And just sharing it out there and being able to find that the more that I shared, the more that I didn't have work around that. Other people had picked it up, sometimes took it in different directions. One of the things in coining the term folksonomy, people were asking whether I was going to trademark it. And I really didn't want to have that done because I knew if I trademarked it, I'd have to protect it, which meant other people couldn't use it. And the value of having a term that separated tagging that was there before to tagging that worked, because you were able to say, oh, this is an engineer tagging this, or this is a marketing person. They're using the same term in drastically different ways. I needed, that sort of tagging needed to be there, and having a term that separated the different types of tagging was valuable. So if I trademarked it, I could be defensive and keep people from using it incorrectly or keep people from making money on it, but it didn't do any value to the whole. And so it's just, I've been watching very closely sort of what's going on with academic papers, and whether they should be open, whether they should be paid, and all of this learning for, essentially this body of knowledge, of human knowledge for all of humanity, sort of, should it be protected and only a few can get to it? Should everybody have access? It's a tough question. And in a world where we have to pay for housing, food, healthcare, all sorts of other things, there is a model that sort of sits in between this open sharing and protecting it so that we can make money and exist in our model that we live in. And so there isn't an easy answer. And some of the open sharing is also just being socially comfortable to share openly, which an awful lot of people aren't. At early South by Southwest in 2001, we called ourselves the broken ones because almost all 1,200 of us that were there in the early days were bloggers. And people thought we were crazy for blogging in 2001 and sharing everything about our lives and what was going on. And we were the edge cases, we weren't the norm. But it's like all 1,200 of us, we all had blogs. And there was a news sharing service called Metafilter, which is still around. We all had accounts on that, somewhat magically, and openly shared things there. And so it was just, a lot of us were doing it to find others who were similar, to find our community as we were spread around the globe, and things that we were passionate about. And so we shared to be able to connect, as much as we shared to be able to share to expand what we knew for others. Okay. Okay.